Title of tonight's lesson is God Fights for His People. And I want to start, like we have been with the other lessons, with a thought question here. Have you ever done your best, made the best decision you could make based on the information you had at the time, and still regretted it? And are you willing to share that with us? Zach? Good idea in terms of like fear and my family or whatever. Really did my best. Did you learn anything from there or change the way you made big decisions after that? Yeah, this is a perfect example. It's exactly what I was hoping for. Anybody else have a similar story you want to talk about? Everybody's just dying to engage tonight. I don't have maybe as specific a story as Zach's, but I do remember when the girls were young, I would fret over decisions that impacted them and impacted the family, thinking that there was a right decision to be made. If I go this direction with it, there will be an outcome that will lead us down this path. When I go this direction with it, lead it down that path. And I used to spend a lot of time and energy just fretting about that and asking God to help me make the right decision. And still, even with all that hand-wringing and praying, I would sometimes look backwards and regret a decision that I made. And then I realized as I got older, there isn't a one right decision. And actually, sometimes the right decision doesn't feel right because of the situation that you end up in. Yeah? Okay, well, that's a valid counterpoint and a good segue into this lesson. And I want to talk about a decision that Joshua made that I think he made with the best intentions, and they ended up regretting it. And so let's revisit and see if that changes anyone's mind. Okay, so who has, Joshua 9, 3 through 7 that can read that for us? All right. Okay, so this passage is telling the story of the Gibeonites' scheme. Now, the context here is that Joshua's fame has spread throughout all the land. We read about that back in chapter 6, specifically in Verse 27. Anybody remember why his fame was spreading? Why people were talking about him? What did he do? Jericho. That's right. Destroy Jericho. It was a big deal. Everybody heard about that. That news spread very quickly. And the Hivites who were living in Gibeon, Hivites are the descendants of Ham. They're Canaanites. They're the people who occupied that land prior to God giving it to the Israelites. They were afraid. Even though they were a big city, they were a big powerhouse, but they saw what Joshua did in Jericho and said, we don't want any part of that. So they greatly feared for their lives, and they pretend to be from far away, dressing the part down to the smallest detail. I mean, to even think, let's make sure that we bring old bread with us when we go talk to the Israelites, because if they see us with new bread and we tell them we're from far away, then they're going to say, hey, wait a minute, why do you have good new bread? Like, how did you do that if you're from far away? So it really gives us this idea that they thought this thing through. They wanted to really put a lot of effort into the details here. Question I want us to consider at this point is, they did all of this to deceive Joshua. Has anyone used this sort of tactic on you to try to get you to make a decision you might not otherwise make? Interesting. I have heard stories about, people following the beggars on the street corners, and they end up following back to a neighborhood and into a house, and yeah, they have much more than they let on. What else? Okay, there's two that I have that I want us to think about tonight. And, whenever I put these lessons together, I try to think about how can we learn something that helps us in our day-to-day life. And so when I think about myself and someone using tactics on me to deceive me and influence the decision I make, two people come to mind. Satan is number one. Satan is going to wrap up whatever it is that you desire in the clothing of, this is good for you if you want it. Why shouldn't you have it? You deserve this. It isn't really wrong. In those kinds of small details that will convince you to make a decision that you shouldn't make. It'll convince you to maybe move forward without thinking, maybe move forward without talking to someone else and getting feedback or advice from someone else who might have been in the same situation. The second person I think of when it comes to trying to deceive me is myself. Because sometimes I do it. I do it to myself. I don't even need Satan to do it. I say, let me tiptoe all the way up to this thing I know I really desire that I shouldn't have, and I'm going to get really close to it. And then maybe if I think about it a little bit, it's really not that bad, right? You kind of get yourself used to it. And so when I read this story and I read about the Gibeonites trying to deceive Joshua, I think about how I deceive myself, and Satan works to deceive me to make me make decisions without going through kind of my proper due diligence. Who is my allegiance to? What does God have to say? Maybe I should ask him. Any thoughts, questions that you want to share on this? Oh, that's a really good one. Yeah, advertising. That's for sure. Where they sexualize everything to sell it, right? Any other thoughts? Yep. I will take your word for this. That's interesting. I actually thought you were going to stop at women are good at deception. I was going to be like, Well, wait a minute. I want to make sure Rachel's actually done. Yeah, playing on the weakness of men who tiptoe right up to the line and wait for some reason to be deceived. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that happen quite a few times. Any other thoughts on this before we move to the next passage? Yeah. Yep, and that's a perfect segue. Thank you for this next passage. Whoever has that one, if you could read that for us, please. Okay, so the result of the Gibeonites' scheme, Joshua says, hey, wait a minute, who are you again? And they answered very truthfully. They said that they were afraid. They were. That's the whole reason why the Gibeonites were doing this. They were afraid of what Joshua would do with them. But the answer was also something that likely appealed to Israel's ego or pride. Joshua's maybe. He'd just come out of this big victory. And he's probably more susceptible at hearing this deception than he would be otherwise. Oh, you're afraid of me. Okay. Yeah, you probably should be. I'm not, saying that's 100% what he was feeling, but it's plausible, right? We get ourselves into situations where we make ourselves more receptive to certain kinds of deceptions. And it's possible that Joshua did that here. But what was Israel's mistake? What was Joshua's mistake in this story? Didn't check with God. Did it make sense for them to check with God? You would definitely think that they would learn their lesson, but was there precedence for them having mercy on people who said that they were afraid of God? Yeah, I mean, Rahab was one, right? Hey, she said, I'm afraid. Like, can you guarantee my family's safety? Yes, we can. And so there could have been some of that in it too, where he goes, well, we've kind of done this before. Maybe we should do it again. But I think you're right, Mike. I think they should have learned the lesson. They should have talked to God. And so my question for us to think about is, does this sound familiar? Do we behave this way? I really like, Zach, I really like your story in the beginning because you said the thing you learned from it is to talk to more people. Learn more about pros and cons. Somebody who's been there, done that kind of thing. Israel should have talked to God and said, hey, I think this is probably okay, but I just want to make sure and check with you. When we are in a moment of temptation, and remember, I think it's in James that talks about the formula for temptation and sin. When desire meets opportunity, that equals temptation. And when temptation meets action, that equals sin. So temptation in itself is not wrong, but when you act on it, it is. What that says is that in the moment of temptation where your desire is aligned with your opportunity, you have a chance to do something about it. And the best thing to do is to talk to God. Give me strength. Help me to understand what is right, to read the Bible. Was anyone in the Bible in this situation? What does the Bible have to say about it? What should I be doing here? Anyone like feel like that they've ever missed that opportunity, that they didn't take it, and then they made the wrong decision? I know I have many, many times. And I think that's the mistake that Joshua made. Any thoughts on this? Yes, that's a really good one. You get it. Yeah, you're like, well, God hasn't answered me yet, so maybe I should do my best and make something happen here. Yeah, I think that's one of the harder things to do, is to learn how to wait. Any other thoughts? Aaron? Sorry, Aaron, then Mike. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, because you don't want to wait to the point of temptation to talk to God, right? You want to be talking to him all the time. That's your habit. That's the way you live your life. And there's been lots of studies that show where you read your Bible every day, it has a massive impact on your obedience to God. So yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Mike. That's a good one. Um, okay, so the takeaway here is seek God always. And Aaron, that fits in with your comment really well, I think. Just like in the first lesson we talked about, Joshua made himself ready even before he knew what he was making himself ready for. We need to seek God always, so that we're prepared when we get into those situations. All right, let's move on. Okay, this section I'm calling God's intervention. So the Gibeonites schemed against Israel. Israel failed to seek God's advice and ended up making a treaty with them. So this is how the story plays out. Who has Joshua 10 can read to us about the Amorite alliance? Okay, so this is a story of the 5 armies, and I was very pleased with myself to have a Hobbit reference in my lesson. So the king of Jerusalem also heard about Joshua. Remember, his fame was spreading throughout all the land, and he did not want to end up like Jericho or Ai. And he also was afraid of the fact that Gibeon was now aligned with Israel, because that would make them even more formidable of a force. And so what he tried to do to equal to that is to convince the other Amorite kings to join forces to defeat Israel, actually to defeat Gibeon. And the thing that occurred to me here is, do we ever join forces against God? And who do we join forces with when we do that? Anybody have any thoughts? Yeah, you joined forces with, I didn't think you were that old, John.
They joined forces.
Oh, they joined forces with each other. Okay. Yeah, that's a good example. You're welcome. Anybody else? Yeah, join forces with Satan. Yeah, that works. Yeah. Yeah, to me, that's kind of more what I had in mind in terms of, although I do agree it's joining forces with Satan, but finding other people who may be wanting to do the same things that you want to do or are doing the same things that you want to do and spending time with them and rationalizing things with them and hey, if all of these people are doing it with me, maybe it's not a bad thing. I think we find lots of ways to join forces with the world as a way of fighting against God. Of course, we know how that's going to turn out. It's not going to turn out good for us. But it feels very similar to King of Jerusalem here, trying to find his peers to gather together with him and physically fight against God's army. Any other thoughts? Ooh.
You all agree. Be no division.
Yeah. And I guarantee you, no one in either faction feels like they're joining forces against God, but they are. Yeah. Wow, that's a really good one. My favorite part about teaching is how much you guys teach me. I like that. That's really good. I hadn't even thought about it in that way, but there's sort of active joining forces and there's passive joining forces. Yeah. Aaron? Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think social media is just a breeding ground for people who are looking to join forces. You know, I'm different. I'm different than everybody around me, but I know my people are out there somewhere, and I'm going to find them. And then, yes, thank you. I feel seen. You know, that's a lot of what happens online. And unfortunately, it happens to people who are, you know, quote unquote religious as well. They're looking for other people who interpret things the way they do. You know, it strikes me that the Amorites were doing this because they were afraid of what God was going to do to them. And it's the same thing with us when we try to join forces. We know that God is going to do something to us because we're not living according to his will. So instead of saying, okay, let me live according to your will, I'll go find a whole bunch of other people who are just as much in trouble as I am, and then I'll feel better about myself. It's when I say it out loud, it's an obviously bad tactic, but I know I've done it before. It's an easy trap to fall in. I see a hand over here. All right, let's move on. Joshua 10:8 and 10 and 11. Did I hand that one out? All right, I'm calling this section God's throwdown because it says God threw them into a panic, and he also threw down large stones from heaven. God is not messing around in this part of the story, is he? It also says later, we didn't read it, but in verse 13 it says the sun did not set the whole day. There was nothing but sunlight while God was putting the beat down on the Amorites. And so my question here is, this is a pretty impressive display of power by God, right? He's making easy work of the Amorites. Is this the same God we serve today? It is, right? I mean, are we saying that because we know it's true intellectually? Or are we saying that because we've seen it in action? Or we're hoping it's true? Like, you don't have to say which unless you want to, but sometimes I think, for me, I say that I know it's the right answer. I know it's the right answer. But do I think about when I am in a situation where I need help and I'm feeling torn and I might make the wrong decision, do I think about praying to the God who would throw down rocks from heaven to defeat Israel's enemies? I don't know if I do. And I wonder if we did sometimes, it would make a difference. You know, I've talked a lot about David and how he starts a lot of his Psalms with, here are the things that I know God has done for me. I have found that helpful in my life when I do that. I think it's also helpful to start a prayer with, here are the things that I know you have done for your people, just in general. And start saying out loud the things that you know God has done. Parting the Red Sea, creating the earth. Like, there's a number of miracles in the Bible that show God's power. Calming of the storm. You know, and when you preface your prayer in that way, then it starts to become like, okay, well, certainly he can help me with this problem. It's really not very big in the grand scheme of things. Any thoughts here? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. The story of Jonah comes to mind too. And if he can give the Ninevites an opportunity to repent, then certainly he's going to give us the opportunity as well. Yeah, good point. All right, let's see here. Who has Joshua 10:40 through 42? Okay, so all the kings were captured, and it says in verse 26 and 27 that Joshua executed the Amorite kings, and he utterly destroyed Makkedah, city in the south. This is basically talking about how Joshua now is capturing the southern part of the promised land, just as he had captured the northern part. And it says from there Joshua struck the whole land, and all that breathed were devoted to destruction. And so I think we're seeing Joshua here learning his lesson about God's promises and trusting in God. And it begs the question, do we believe that God will give us victory? When we read about Joshua, I think sometimes for myself, I think about, and this is true of other biblical stories, how did they not know? How did he not do this thing or abstain from doing this thing? Like, didn't he know? Didn't God talk to him? Didn't God promise him? And then it hits me, yeah, well, I'm in the same boat. God has talked to me. He talks to me through his word. Did I spend time in it? Did I listen to him? Why didn't I believe? And it's, hindsight is 20/20, so we read the stories. It's like when you're watching a TV show, don't go in there. That guy's the murderer. We don't see it in our own lives as our lives are unfolding. And so it's something we have to be very intentional about, to say, I believe in God. I will trust him. He said he will take care of me. And then he'll give us victory if we do that, the way he gave Joshua victory. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide here, just to make sure we don't run out of time. Theron, I think you have this one.
The Lord gave it also, and the Lord gave it also, and it came into the hand of Israel. He struck it with the edge of the sword, and every person in it. He left none remaining in it. He did it to its king, as he had done to the king. He had done to the king of Jericho. The Lord gave Lachish into the hand of Israel. He captured it on the second day, and struck it with the edge of the sword, and every person in it, as he had done in Libnah. And Joshua captured all these cities, their land at one time, as the Lord God of Israel.
Okay, so again, the Lord gives victory. It says that the Lord gave them into Israel's hands. Really interesting to me that he says that 4 times in verse 8, 19, 30, and 32. And smarter people than me have determined that the number 4 in the Bible means completeness, divine order, stability. It's really more in reference to the physical world sometimes. And, if that's true, what it's conveying to us here is that the God gave complete victory to Israel because he was the one fighting for them. So I want us to spend maybe a minute or two here thinking about that. Aaron? Yeah, no, I completely agree. What comes to mind for me on that is Caleb. So at the end of it all, Caleb says, this is the land that I want. And he chooses the land where the giants are living. He's 87 years old. And he says, I'm as strong as I was at 40, which was back when he was an original one of the 12 spies saying, we can take them. And here he is now, 40-some years later, and he's saying, yeah, I can take them. Give me that land. I'll take it. That's what real faith in God providing the victory looks like. Because I don't know for sure if he was actually capable of still fighting like he was at 40. Maybe he was, but because of his faith, he felt like he was. Yeah. Did I see a hand over here? Okay. Everyone looks away when I... So, God fought for Israel. He gave them into Israel's hand. It says it 4 times. How do we make sure God is fighting for us? This is not a trick question. How do we make sure God fights for us? Fight for God. Okay. Yeah. Makes sense? Aaron? Oh, yeah. Joining forces. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Basic stuff. Pray. Study. Be baptized. I think the important thing to remember is, and we talked about this in the prayer class, God is not a vending machine. You don't find yourself in trouble and then go, okay, let me see, A6. And victory drops down from the vending machine. Thanks, God. Good thing I had exact change. It doesn't work that way. Prayer is meant to be a connection of God's heart with our heart. It's supposed to bring us together so that we become one together. And I've talked about this before. We have these things called mirror neurons. If you sit down with somebody, even a stranger, and start to have a conversation with them, your heartbeats start to sync up eventually over time. You and somebody you never met before, just from sitting down across from each other having a conversation. That's the kind of thing I like to think about when I'm praying, that my heart is syncing up with God's, so that what he wants, what he fights for, I want, I'm fighting for. Prayer, I think, is a really important part of making sure that God fights for you. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Well, maybe you'll help their heart. Okay, I like to end on the thought question. Do you rely on God's promises? God promised Joshua that he'd be victorious. Joshua doubted that occasionally. I know, doubt it occasionally too. So think about that in the next week. And then also, too, I want to say, next lesson is claiming the promised land. And so if you can read 11 through 21, it's a big reading. But that we're going to be covering, obviously, at a high level, those chapters. And to end on Mike's point, if you're making the decision to the best of your ability, you shouldn't regret it. I think that is true if you're including loyalty to God, going to God for guidance, and your desire is to do what he wills, 100%. You'll never regret it. All right. Thank you very much.